When you hear the word king, you probably imagine absolute control. A man who gives an order and the world moves. Armies march. Laws change. Lives are decided with a single command. That image feels natural because modern storytelling has repeated it for centuries. But in reality, medieval kings were far weaker than we assume. Many of them could not raise taxes freely. They could not enforce laws everywhere. They could not control distant regions. Some could not even enter parts of their own kingdoms without permission. Power was fragmented, negotiated, and constantly threatened, not centralized. This video is about the gap between the crown and actual control. We're going to look at how medieval power really worked, why kings depended on nobles, cities, and institutions they did not fully command, and how a ruler could wear a crown while still being constrained at every turn. By the end, you may realize that medieval kings ruled more by compromise than command. Before we begin, I'm curious, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Write it in the comments. It's always interesting to see how people across different places connect to the same moment in history. If you enjoy history that breaks popular myths and explains how power actually functioned, like the video and subscribe. These stories build slowly, and the most revealing parts always come later. Now let's strip away the fantasy and see how much power medieval kings really had. The biggest misunderstanding about medieval kings is the assumption that authority automatically translated into power. In reality, wearing a crown did not mean commanding obedience across an entire kingdom. It meant standing at the center of a fragile network of obligations, negotiations, and limits. A medieval king was not an absolute ruler by default. He was a coordinator of competing interests, many of which he did not fully control. Power in the medieval world was not centralized. It was layered, local, and conditional. A king's authority depended on people who had their own power bases: nobles, landholders, city councils, military leaders, and local officials. These figures were not passive servants waiting for orders. They were partners, rivals, and sometimes obstacles. A king could issue commands, but enforcement was another matter entirely. Most medieval kingdoms lacked a standing bureaucracy capable of carrying out royal will uniformly. There was no nationwide police force, no centralized tax system that functioned independently of local cooperation, and no reliable mechanism to impose royal decisions everywhere at once. Orders had to travel slowly, often through intermediaries who interpreted them according to local interests. Distance alone weakened royal power. A king might rule a territory that took weeks to cross. By the time instructions arrived, circumstances had already changed. Local leaders made decisions in the meantime, often without consulting the crown. The king learned about events after they happened, not before. This meant power was reactive rather than proactive. Even within close reach of the royal court, authority depended on consent. Nobles controlled land, resources, and armed retainers. The king needed their cooperation to raise armies, collect taxes, and maintain order. Without that cooperation, royal authority became symbolic rather than practical. This dependence shaped everything. Kings had to persuade rather than command. They negotiated privileges, confirmed local rights, and granted exemptions in exchange for loyalty. Each concession strengthened local autonomy while weakening centralized control. Power was constantly traded away to keep the system functioning. Feudal relationships are often misunderstood as chains of obedience flowing downward from the king. In reality, they were reciprocal agreements. A noble owed service, but the king owed protection and recognition. If a king failed to uphold his side, loyalty weakened. Loyalty was conditional, not automatic. This conditionality applied even to taxation. Medieval kings could not simply decide to raise taxes whenever they wished. Taxation required consent from powerful groups. In many regions, assemblies of nobles or representatives had to approve new levies. Without approval, tax collection could trigger resistance or refusal. A king who overreached financially risked rebellion. This made funding a constant struggle. Wars, administration, and court expenses drained resources quickly. Kings often found themselves chronically short of money, even while ruling wealthy lands. Wealth existed locally, not centrally. Extracting it required cooperation. Military power followed the same pattern. Medieval kings rarely maintained large standing armies. Instead, they relied on nobles to provide troops when needed. These troops were loyal to their immediate lords first, not directly to the king. This divided loyalty mattered. In battle, cooperation depended on personal relationships, shared interests, and expectations of reward. A noble could withhold support, arrive late, or leave early if conditions were unfavorable. The king could not simply enforce discipline through hierarchy alone. Command was negotiated in real time. Even castles, often seen as symbols of royal dominance, were frequently controlled by nobles rather than the king himself. A castle in the king's name might be governed by a local lord whose allegiance was pragmatic rather than absolute. Control over fortifications was dispersed, not centralized. The king's presence mattered immensely. Authority was strongest where the king physically was. When he left, power reverted to local hands. This made royal travel essential but exhausting. Kings moved constantly, not for ceremony, but to maintain influence. Absence weakened authority. Law enforcement reflected the same reality. Kings issued laws, but implementation depended on local courts and officials. These officials often prioritized local custom over royal decree. Justice varied from place to place. A king's law might exist on parchment, but not in practice. Uniform rule was impossible. Communication limits amplified all of this. Messages traveled slowly and could be intercepted, altered, or ignored. There was no instant feedback. A king could not monitor compliance easily. He relied on reports that were often biased or incomplete. This made control fragile. Even the image of kingship masked insecurity. Ceremonies, rituals, and symbolism were not expressions of overwhelming power. They were compensations for its absence. Pageantry reinforced legitimacy where enforcement was weak. Legitimacy had to be performed. A king who appeared weak invited challenge. Rivals within the nobility watched closely for signs of vulnerability. Succession disputes, illness, financial strain, or military failure could quickly unravel authority. Kingship was never secure. It had to be defended constantly. Defense required compromise. This constant balancing act consumed attention. Kings spent more time managing relationships than issuing orders. Court politics, marriages, alliances, and favors were tools of governance. Power flowed through people, not institutions. Institutions were underdeveloped. Even when a king won a military victory, control afterward was uncertain. Conquered territories did not automatically submit. They required local elites to cooperate. Without their cooperation, occupation was unstable and expensive. Victory did not equal control. The idea of absolute monarchy belongs mostly to later periods, when bureaucracies, standing armies, and centralized taxation became possible. Medieval kings operated in a fundamentally different system. They ruled, but they did not dominate. This explains why medieval politics often appear chaotic. From the outside, it looks like constant rebellion, negotiation, and instability. From the inside, it was normal. Power was distributed because it had to be. Distributed power limited kings intentionally. Local elites resisted centralization because it threatened their autonomy. Kings understood this. Pushing too hard risked fragmentation. A fragmented kingdom was worse than a weakly centralized one. Thus, restraint became strategy. Kings often accepted limits rather than challenged them. They ruled within constraints, not above them. Their success depended on maintaining balance, not imposing will. Balance was fragile. This fragility explains why medieval kingship was so personal. Authority rested on individual relationships rather than impersonal systems. A capable king could maintain influence through skillful negotiation. An incapable one could lose control quickly. Skill mattered more than title. The crown symbolized unity, but unity was aspirational rather than actual. The king represented the idea of a kingdom more than its daily reality. Reality was local. Understanding this gap between symbolism and power is essential. Medieval kings were not weak because they failed. They were limited because the system demanded it. Power had to be shared to survive. And this shared power meant that a medieval king's authority was always conditional, always negotiated, and always vulnerable. This is only the first layer of why medieval kings had less power than we imagine. Even when a medieval king appeared powerful on paper, the reality of ruling exposed how fragile that power actually was. Authority existed only where it could be reinforced, and reinforcement was expensive, slow, and unreliable. A king could proclaim himself ruler of vast lands, but control over those lands depended entirely on cooperation from people who were not easily replaceable. One of the greatest limits on royal power was land ownership. Land was the primary source of wealth, food, and military force. Yet kings rarely controlled most of it directly. Large portions of territory were held by nobles who governed them as semi-independent domains. These nobles collected rents, administered justice, and maintained armed followers. In practice, they functioned like rulers within their own regions. The king's authority over these lands was symbolic unless actively supported by the local lord. If a noble chose to resist, the king's options were limited. He could attempt negotiation, offer concessions, or threaten force. But force required troops, and troops required cooperation from other nobles. This circular dependency meant that punishment was risky. Punishing one powerful noble could provoke others to unite against the crown. Rebellion was not rare because kings were weak individuals. It was common because the system made resistance feasible. The king also lacked permanent enforcement tools. There was no professional army loyal only to the crown in most medieval periods. Soldiers were raised temporarily and dismissed when campaigns ended. Loyalty was personal and conditional. A noble might serve faithfully 1 year and withhold support the next if circumstances changed. Military power was episodic, not continuous. This meant that even victories had limited impact. Defeating a rival did not guarantee long-term obedience. Once the campaign ended and forces dispersed, local power structures reasserted themselves. Control evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. Time worked against kings. Communication delays further weakened authority. Orders traveled by messengers who could be delayed, misdirected, or influenced. A king could not supervise execution of commands in real time. Local officials interpreted instructions through the lens of local custom and personal interest. Interpretation was power. This made royal law inconsistent. The same decree could produce different outcomes in different regions. Uniform enforcement was impossible. Kings knew this and often tolerated variation rather than provoke resistance. Tolerance replaced consistency. Financial limits compounded everything. Kings needed money to govern, but reliable revenue streams were rare. Royal income came from lands directly controlled by the crown, fees, fines, and extraordinary taxes. None of these were sufficient on their own. War, diplomacy, and administration consumed funds rapidly. Chronic shortage defined kingship. When kings sought new taxes, they faced resistance. Assemblies of nobles or representatives demanded concessions in exchange for approval. These concessions often limited future royal authority. Each financial crisis weakened the crown incrementally. Power eroded through necessity. Even the royal court itself was a source of vulnerability. Kings depended on advisors, officials, and family members to govern. These individuals had their own ambitions. Court politics were complex and often dangerous. Influence mattered more than formal authority. A king could be isolated within his own court. Succession was another major weakness. Medieval kingship was rarely secure across generations. The death of a ruler often triggered uncertainty. Heirs could be contested. Regents ruled in the name of minors. Rivals exploited transitions. Continuity was fragile. Because of this, kings often ruled defensively. They avoided drastic changes. Stability mattered more than reform. A reform that angered powerful interests could undo decades of careful balance. Balance became the goal. The king's symbolic role compensated for these limits. Rituals, ceremonies, and public displays reinforced legitimacy. Crowns, thrones, and processions were not expressions of excess power. They were tools to project unity and authority where direct control was lacking. Symbolism filled gaps left by weak institutions. Religion, law, and tradition were invoked to strengthen royal claims, but invocation did not guarantee compliance. Even legitimacy was negotiated. A king recognized as rightful could still be constrained by custom. Custom often overruled command. This is why medieval kings spent so much time confirming rights rather than imposing new ones. They governed by reaffirming existing arrangements. Change was incremental and cautious. Caution preserved authority. Even when kings attempted to centralize power, progress was slow. Building institutions required money, trust, and time. Resistance was constant. Centralization threatened local autonomy, and local elites defended their privileges fiercely. Privilege was power. The result was a system where kings were visible, important, and influential, but not omnipotent. They shaped outcomes, but rarely dictated them unilaterally. They operated within a web of constraints that modern audiences often underestimate. Understanding this changes how we interpret medieval history. Apparent indecision was often necessity. Compromise was survival. Weakness was structural, not personal. Medieval kings ruled, but they did so by navigating limits rather than abolishing them. The crown was not a command center. It was a balancing point, and this balance defined medieval power more than any decree ever could. Even when a medieval king managed to secure loyalty at court, gather support among major nobles, and project authority through ceremony, his power weakened rapidly the moment it moved outward. The farther authority traveled from the throne, the less real it became. This was not a failure of leadership. It was a structural reality of medieval governance. Kings ruled territories, not systems. A medieval kingdom was not a unified machine that responded evenly to command. It was a collection of regions with their own customs, laws, elites, and power dynamics. These regions had existed long before the crown that claimed them. The king did not create them. He inherited them, often reluctantly. Inheritance did not guarantee obedience. Local rule was deeply entrenched. Lords governed their lands as inherited rights, not delegated responsibilities. They held courts, enforced law, collected dues, and maintained order according to local custom. The king's authority existed above this structure, but rarely replaced it. This meant that royal power layered on top of existing systems instead of overriding them. Layered power is fragile. When a king issued a command, it entered this layered structure and was filtered. Local officials interpreted it through custom. Nobles weighed it against their interests. Communities evaluated whether compliance was worth the cost. The result was not automatic obedience, but negotiation through delay, partial compliance, or quiet resistance. Resistance was often subtle. Ignoring an order outright was risky. Delaying it was safer. Reinterpreting it was safer still. A king might believe a policy was being implemented, while in reality it was being reshaped at every level. This gap between intent and outcome defined medieval rule. The king lacked the means to audit compliance effectively. There was no centralized information system. Reports came from people with incentives to distort truth. Local officials often belonged to the same elite they were supposed to regulate. Oversight depended on trust. Trust was personal, not institutional. A king trusted individuals, not offices. If a trusted official died, defected, or failed, control vanished with him. There was no interchangeable bureaucracy to replace him seamlessly. This made governance fragile and slow. Royal travel was one solution, but it revealed another limit. Kings moved constantly to assert authority, hear cases, and reinforce loyalty. However, when the king arrived in a region, his presence disrupted normal power balances. Local elites performed loyalty while negotiating advantage. Once he left, old patterns resumed. Presence created compliance. Absence erased it. Because travel was exhausting and time-consuming, kings could not be everywhere. Their absence was the default state. Authority was therefore intermittent. Intermittent power is weak power. Military authority followed the same pattern. Kings did not command armies as permanent institutions. They assembled forces temporarily through obligation and reward. Soldiers served for limited periods. Campaigns were seasonal. Once obligations were fulfilled, forces dissolved. A king could win a battle and lose control weeks later. This instability made long-term enforcement nearly impossible. Occupation required resources the crown did not have. Garrisons were expensive. Supplying them strained finances. Local cooperation was cheaper than force. Thus, compromise was rational. Legal authority suffered similarly. Royal law existed alongside local law, not above it. Local courts prioritized precedent and custom. Royal intervention was exceptional, not routine. A king could proclaim justice, but its reach was limited. Justice was negotiated locally. This fragmentation meant that kings could not standardize rule. Uniformity was a modern concept. Medieval governance accepted variation as normal. Attempting uniformity risked resistance. Resistance weakened legitimacy. Legitimacy mattered more than enforcement. A king perceived as violating tradition could lose support even if his actions were technically legal. Custom constrained power more effectively than law. Kings ruled within expectation. Expectation was shaped by history, not crown. Financial control revealed perhaps the clearest limit. Kings needed money to govern. but they could not extract it freely. Taxation required consent, negotiation, or coercion, all of which carried risk. Excessive demands provoked resistance. Insufficient demands weakened capacity. The crown was always underfunded. Royal revenue streams were inconsistent. Income from royal lands varied. Fees fluctuated. Extraordinary taxes required approval. Debt was common. Credit depended on reputation. A king's financial weakness limited all other power. Without money, authority was symbolic. Symbolic authority had value, but only to a point. When crises emerged, war, famine, rebellion, symbolism was insufficient. Kings relied on allies. Allies demanded concessions. Concessions reduced future authority. This cycle repeated endlessly. Crisis forced compromise. Compromise weakened the crown. Weakness invited new crises. Stability was temporary. Succession intensified these problems. Each transition reopened negotiations. Nobles reasserted privileges. Regions tested limits. New kings inherited constraints, not control. A strong ruler could stabilize temporarily. A weak one exposed fault lines quickly. But strength was not permanent. Kings aged. Illness intervened. Death ended everything. The system reset with each reign. This impermanence discouraged long-term reform. Why build institutions that might not survive succession? Short-term balance was safer. Safety over progress. Even ideology reinforced limits. Kingship was framed as stewardship rather than domination. A king was expected to rule justly, respect tradition, and preserve order. Overreach was seen as tyranny. Tyranny justified resistance. Resistance, when framed as defense of custom, gained legitimacy. Thus, the system protected itself against centralization. Modern audiences often mistake this for weakness. In reality, it was equilibrium. A fully centralized medieval kingdom would have been unstable. Infrastructure, communication, and resources could not support it. Limits were functional. The king's role was to sit at the center of this equilibrium and prevent collapse. That required restraint more than force. Force was expensive. Restraint was sustainable. This is why medieval kings appear hesitant, cautious, or inconsistent in historical records. These traits were survival strategies. Decisiveness without capacity is reckless. The throne did not grant omnipotence. It granted responsibility for managing limits. This is the key insight. Medieval kings did not fail to become absolute rulers. Absolute rule was structurally impossible. Power stopped at the edge of the throne. Beyond it, authority diffused into land, custom, obligation, and negotiation. Understanding this makes medieval politics clearer. Kings were not weak men in strong positions. They were constrained men balancing fragile systems. And the crown was not a weapon. It was a burden. In the medieval world, royal power did not belong to the king in the way modern authority belongs to a head of state. It was borrowed, conditional, and always dependent on circumstances beyond the king's direct control. The crown did not function as a source of absolute command. It functioned as a focal point where competing forces temporarily aligned. When those forces shifted, power shifted with them. A medieval king could not act alone for long. Every decision required support, and support always came at a price. Nobles, cities, religious institutions, military leaders, and even families expected concessions in exchange for loyalty. These concessions were not symbolic. They altered the balance of power permanently. Each agreement solved an immediate problem while weakening future authority. This meant that medieval kingship was reactive by nature. Kings responded to pressures rather than shaping environments freely. When famine threatened, they negotiated relief. When war loomed, they bargained for troops. When succession approached, they secured recognition. Every moment of rule involved maintaining equilibrium, not enforcing vision. This dependence extended into the legal system. Laws were not tools for unilateral control. They were frameworks negotiated with existing custom. A king could not simply rewrite legal norms without triggering resistance. Even when royal courts existed, they coexisted with local jurisdictions that answered first to tradition, not decree. Justice was local before it was royal. As a result, kings often confirmed laws rather than created them. Confirmation preserved legitimacy. Creation invited conflict. Over time, this reinforced the idea that royal authority was bound by inherited norms. The king stood above the law symbolically, but operated within it practically. Military authority followed the same pattern. Medieval kings did not command armies that belonged to the state. They assembled forces that belonged to individuals. Knights, levies, and mercenaries followed leaders they trusted or benefited from. Loyalty was temporary. Service was limited. Once obligations expired, control vanished. This meant that even successful campaigns did not translate into permanent dominance. Victories required rewards. Rewards cost land, money, or privilege. Every reward redistributed power away from the crown. The more a king relied on force, the weaker his position became afterward. Money intensified these limits. Medieval economies were decentralized. Wealth existed in land, harvests, tolls, and trade routes controlled locally. The crown's income was limited and unpredictable. Royal treasuries emptied quickly. Debt became common. Credit depended on reputation. A king who failed financially lost political leverage. This financial fragility meant kings could not sustain prolonged enforcement. Garrisons were expensive. Administration required pay. Communication required messengers and roads. All of these drained resources faster than they replenished them. The result was a constant shortage that forced compromise. Compromise became the core skill of kingship. Kings who survived longest were not those who commanded most aggressively, but those who conceded strategically. They learned when to press and when to retreat. They accepted limits as part of rule. Distance magnified every weakness. Beyond the immediate vicinity of the royal court, authority faded. Regional rulers exercised autonomy because they had to. Communication delays meant that local leaders acted first and informed the crown later. Kings ruled retrospectively, not prospectively. This produced a political culture where initiative belonged to local power holders. The crown ratified outcomes more often than it directed them. When the king opposed a local decision, he needed allies. Allies demanded compensation. Compensation weakened central authority. Even symbolism, often mistaken for evidence of power, functioned as a substitute for enforcement. Rituals, titles, and ceremonies created the appearance of unity. They reassured subjects and elites alike that the system held. But appearance masked fragility. A medieval king knew this. That is why so much effort went into maintaining dignity, lineage, and continuity. These were not luxuries. They were tools to stabilize a system that could collapse quickly. Succession exposed this fragility most clearly. When a king died, power did not pass smoothly by default. It had to be recognized, accepted, and reinforced. Each transition reopened negotiations. Nobles reasserted rights. Cities demanded confirmation of privileges. The new king inherited obligations, not control. This meant that even strong kings ruled temporarily. Their authority ended with them. Institutions were too weak to carry power forward automatically. Every reign began again from a position of uncertainty. Because of this, long-term reform was risky. Why challenge entrenched interests if the gains might not survive the next transition? Stability favored continuity over transformation. Kings who attempted radical centralization often triggered backlash. Backlash was dangerous. Resistance did not always take the form of rebellion. It appeared as noncompliance, delay, reinterpretation, and quiet defiance. These forms of resistance were difficult to punish without provoking wider conflict. Kings tolerated them because alternatives were worse. Tolerance became governance. This created a paradox. Medieval kings were necessary for unity, but incapable of domination. They represented the kingdom, but did not control it fully. They were powerful figures in weak positions. Modern interpretations often mistake this for incompetence. In reality, it was systemic. Medieval societies lacked the infrastructure required for centralized power. Roads were poor. Communication was slow. Records were inconsistent. Literacy was limited. Enforcement mechanisms were primitive. Absolute power required tools that did not yet exist. The crown existed within these limits. Kings who understood this ruled longer. Kings who ignored it fell faster. This is why medieval kings appear cautious, restrained, and compromise-driven. They were not indecisive. They were constrained. Every decision carried the risk of destabilizing the balance that kept the kingdom intact. Power was not something a medieval king could seize and hold. It was something he borrowed from many sources and tried to keep aligned. Once alignment failed, authority dissolved. This reality dismantles the myth of the all-powerful medieval ruler. Kings mattered enormously, but not because they controlled everything. They mattered because without them, fragmentation accelerated. They were anchors, not commanders. And anchors do not move ships. They keep them from drifting apart. By the late medieval period, it became increasingly clear that royal authority did not flow outward naturally from the crown. It existed only where other power holders allowed it to exist. This was not a failure of ambition or intelligence on the part of kings. It was the logical outcome of a world where power was rooted in land, relationships, and custom rather than centralized institutions. A medieval king did not rule empty space. He ruled over people who already possessed authority of their own. Lords controlled land and labor. Cities controlled trade and money. Local courts controlled justice. Even families controlled loyalty. The crown sat above all of this symbolically, but it could not erase it. Authority in this world was relational. This meant that power had to be constantly renewed. A king could not assume obedience based on title alone. Every command had to be supported by agreement, fear, incentive, or tradition. If none of those were present, the command failed quietly. Not with dramatic rebellion, but with non-action. Non-action was the most common form of resistance. A village that delayed tax payment. A noble who failed to appear with troops. A city that interpreted a royal order narrowly. These acts rarely looked rebellious, but they drained authority steadily. Over time, they defined the real limits of kingship. This environment trained kings to think defensively. They learned not to ask what they wanted to achieve, but what they could realistically enforce. Vision was dangerous. Pragmatism was survival. The king's authority was strongest in moments of crisis, not because he was more powerful, but because crises temporarily aligned interests. War, famine, or external threat pushed local powers to cooperate. Once the crisis passed, cooperation dissolved. Crisis created unity. Peace dissolved it. This pattern explains why medieval kings often appear active during wars, but passive during peace. War justified extraordinary authority. Peace restored limits. This is also why kings sometimes prolonged conflict unnecessarily. Conflict maintained leverage. Peace reduced it. Even within the royal court, authority was negotiated rather than absolute. Advisors, relatives, and officials competed for influence. Access to the king mattered more than rank. Control over information mattered more than law. A king without reliable advisors was powerless. But advisors were never neutral. They pursued their own interests. The king had to balance them carefully. Favoring one group alienated another. Alienation threatened stability. Stability demanded compromise. This internal balancing mirrored the external one. Kings balanced nobles, cities, regions, and institutions simultaneously. Any imbalance risked fragmentation. Fragmentation was the ultimate failure. Because of this, medieval kingship rewarded caution, patience, and endurance. Aggression without support led to collapse. Reform without consent led to resistance. Centralization without infrastructure led to rebellion. Power had to move slowly. Slow power looks weak to modern observers. But in medieval conditions, speed was dangerous. Decisions made too quickly could not be enforced consistently. Slow negotiation allowed alignment. Alignment mattered more than speed. This reality shaped royal identity. Kings did not see themselves as absolute masters. They saw themselves as guardians of order. Order was fragile. Preserving it required restraint. Restraint was not moral virtue. It was necessity. Even punishment reflected this. Kings rarely punished powerful figures severely unless absolutely necessary. Punishment removed allies and created enemies. Mercy preserved balance. Mercy was strategic. Law functioned similarly. Royal justice focused on arbitration rather than enforcement. Courts mediated disputes instead of imposing uniform outcomes. The goal was resolution, not domination. Domination provoked backlash. This system depended heavily on legitimacy. Legitimacy was not abstract. It was practical. A legitimate king was one whose actions fit expectation. Deviating from expectation undermined authority faster than failure. Expectation constrained power more effectively than law. This meant that even strong kings operated within narrow bounds. They could choose among limited options, but they could not redefine the system unilaterally. The crown did not grant freedom of action. It imposed responsibility. Responsibility without control is burdensome. This burden explains why medieval kings often appear anxious, indecisive, or overly cautious in historical accounts. They were not weak personalities. They were navigating a system that punished overreach severely. The king was always one mistake away from crisis. Mistakes could trigger noble coalitions, urban resistance, or regional defiance. Recovering from such crises required concessions that weakened the crown further. Weakening was cumulative. Over generations, this accumulation defined the limits of medieval monarchy. Kings did not gradually lose power. They inherited a structure designed to resist concentration. Resistance was intentional. Local elites defended autonomy because it protected them. The crown accepted limits because enforcing control was too costly. This mutual restraint produced stability at the expense of central authority. Stability mattered more than dominance. This explains why medieval kingdoms survived despite weak kingship. The system did not rely on strong rulers. It relied on shared interest in continuity. Continuity kept borders intact and resources flowing. Kings symbolized that continuity. They did not create it. When kings attempted to transcend this role, they often failed. Their failures reinforced the system's resistance to change. The myth of absolute medieval kingship persists because later periods projected their structures backward. Bureaucracy, standing armies, centralized taxation, and national law transformed kings into rulers of systems rather than coordinators of relationships. Medieval kings lived before those tools existed. Judging them by later standards distorts reality. In their own context, medieval kings exercised as much power as the system allowed. That power was limited not by incompetence, but by design. Authority existed only where others allowed it, and that allowance was conditional, fragile, and temporary. This is why medieval kings had less power than we think, not because they were weak, but because power itself was different. One of the most misleading assumptions about medieval kingship is the idea that authority flowed naturally from the crown outward into society. In reality, authority had to be continuously constructed, maintained, and defended through negotiation. It did not exist independently of the people who accepted it. A medieval king did not possess power in isolation. He operated within a dense web of relationships that both enabled and restricted his rule. Every decision a king made had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate goal. Granting a privilege to one noble could alienate another. Favoring a city could anger surrounding landholders. Enforcing law in one region could provoke resistance in another. Because power was distributed rather than centralized, each action shifted balances that were already delicate. This forced kings to govern cautiously. Bold decisions carried high risk. Incremental change was safer. Even kings who wanted to expand their authority often found that doing so required concessions that canceled out any gain. Power gained through agreement was always temporary because agreements were renegotiated whenever circumstances changed. Circumstances changed constantly. Weather affected harvests. Harvests affected revenue. Revenue affected military capability. Military capability affected leverage. Leverage affected negotiation. A king's authority rose and fell with forces he did not control. He reacted more than he acted. He responded more than he commanded. This reactive nature of medieval kingship shaped political culture. Kings were expected to listen, consult, and confirm rather than dictate. Ruling was a process of managing expectations, not enforcing vision. Vision without capacity was dangerous. Capacity without legitimacy was useless. Legitimacy depended on recognition by others. Recognition came from tradition, custom, lineage, and performance. A king had to behave as a king was expected to behave. Deviating from that expectation weakened his authority regardless of intent. This meant that even when kings possessed theoretical rights, they could not always exercise them. Royal authority was constrained not only by external forces, but by internal belief systems. Society accepted limits on kingship as normal. The idea that a ruler should govern within bounds was deeply ingrained. Overstepping those bounds was interpreted as tyranny rather than strength. This perception empowered resistance. Resistance did not need to be violent to be effective. Refusal, delay, reinterpretation, and passive noncompliance were sufficient. These forms of resistance were difficult to punish without escalating conflict. Escalation required resources and allies. Allies demanded concessions. Thus, enforcement often cost more power than it gained. This explains why medieval kings relied heavily on persuasion and symbolism. Ceremonies, councils, oaths, and rituals were not decorative extras. They were mechanisms of governance. They created shared understanding and reaffirmed relationships. They compensated for the lack of coercive capacity. Councils mattered because kings could not rule alone. Consultation was not a sign of weakness. It was a necessity. Decisions made without consultation risked alienating key supporters. Alienation threatened stability. Stability was the primary goal. Modern observers often misinterpret medieval compromise as indecision. In fact, compromise was how authority survived. A king who refused to compromise quickly isolated himself. Isolation made enforcement impossible. Enforcement failure undermined legitimacy. Legitimacy once lost was difficult to recover. This dynamic applied equally to law, finance, and warfare. Laws had to align with custom. Taxes had to align with consent. Wars had to align with interest. Misalignment in any of these areas produced resistance. Because of this, kingship required constant adjustment. There was no fixed level of power. Authority expanded and contracted depending on context. A successful campaign might increase leverage temporarily. A failed harvest might erase it entirely. Power was situational. This situational nature of power meant that kings spent much of their reign managing risk rather than pursuing ambition. Ambition without support led to collapse. Prudence prolonged rule. Prudence, however, often looked like weakness. Historical narratives tend to favor dramatic figures who attempted to centralize authority aggressively. These figures stand out precisely because they were exceptions. Many failed. Their failures reinforced the system's resistance to centralization. The system endured because it absorbed shocks. This endurance came at the cost of efficiency. Medieval governance was slow, inconsistent, and fragmented, but it was resilient. It could survive bad rulers because power was not concentrated enough to collapse with one individual. This is why medieval kingship often appears chaotic but rarely disappears entirely. The crown functioned as a stabilizing symbol rather than an absolute command center. It represented continuity across generations, even when individual kings struggled. This symbolic role mattered deeply. Without it, fragmentation accelerated. Kings mattered not because they controlled everything, but because they prevented everything from falling apart. This reframes the concept of weakness. Medieval kings were not weak because they lacked control. They were limited because control itself was distributed. The system prioritized survival over efficiency. Survival required balance. Balance required negotiation. Negotiation required restraint. Restraint limited power. This chain defined medieval rule. The myth of the all-powerful medieval king persists because later political systems projected their structures backward. Once centralized states developed bureaucracies, standing armies, and consistent taxation, kings became rulers of systems rather than managers of relationships. It became possible to impose authority uniformly. That world did not exist in the medieval period. Judging medieval kings by modern standards misunderstands their context. They exercised as much power as was structurally possible. Beyond that, power did not exist to be exercised. This is the core insight. Medieval kings did not fail to become absolute rulers. Absolute rule was not available to them. Authority was never something they owned. It was something they borrowed from others and tried to keep aligned. When alignment failed, authority faded. That is why medieval kings had less power than you think. Not because they lacked ambition, not because they lacked intelligence, but because power itself functioned differently in their world. When we strip away centuries of myth, storytelling, and modern assumptions, one reality becomes clear. Medieval kingship was never about absolute control. It was about survival inside a system that actively resisted concentration of power. Kings ruled, but they did so by balancing forces they could not dominate, institutions they did not fully command, and people whose cooperation mattered more than their obedience. The crown did not create power. It gathered it temporarily. Every medieval king inherited a landscape already filled with authority. Landholders, cities, local courts, families, and customs all possessed real power before the king ever spoke. His role was not to erase these forces, but to coordinate them just enough to keep the kingdom intact. That coordination required negotiation, compromise, and restraint. Overreach invited resistance. Resistance threatened fragmentation. Fragmentation was the ultimate failure. This is why medieval kings appear cautious, hesitant, and compromise-driven in historical records. They were not weak rulers trapped in strong positions. They were strong figures trapped in systems that punished unilateral action. Power existed, but it was distributed by design, because medieval societies lacked the infrastructure, communication, and resources required for centralized rule. Authority functioned only where others allowed it to function. Even war, often imagined as a king's strongest tool, reinforced these limits. Armies were temporary. Loyalty was conditional. Victories required rewards, and rewards weakened the crown. Finance followed the same pattern. Taxation required consent. Debt created dependence. Dependence reduced leverage. Nothing accumulated cleanly at the center. Over time, kings learned that endurance mattered more than dominance. Stability mattered more than vision. Legitimacy mattered more than force. They ruled by maintaining balance, not by imposing will. The crown symbolized unity precisely because unity was fragile. Understanding this does not diminish medieval kings. It places them back into their real historical context. They governed as much as their world allowed them to govern. The limits they faced were not personal failures. They were structural realities. And once we see that, the fantasy collapses. Medieval kings did not lack power because they were ineffective. They lacked absolute power because absolute power did not yet exist. What existed instead was negotiation, restraint, and survival. That is what medieval rule truly was.